Welcome back to That CMMC Show. I'm joined by my good friend Wendy, who we've had a pleasure of doing a panel together with a couple of years ago in the great state of Colorado. Wendy, tell us a little about yourself and then we'll kick it off.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Daniel. I can't believe it's been a year and a half since we first met at CS2 in Denver. You know, a lot's happened since 23, but hi, everybody. I am Wendy Epley, and I wish I had a cool title like Jacob Horn, but at the University of Arizona, I serve as a principal analyst in the Information Security Office on the Governance, Risk, and Compliance team. We just say ISOGRC for short. And in my role, I help departments across the institution in understanding information security risks that may be present in contracts. I am also the lead for the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act compliance program, and I also lead a new program called Information Security Maturity, which is based on the elements of the CMMC program, but it's not just for CUI, for controlled and classified information. I've worked as a compliance professional for nearly 20 years now, specializing in regulatory compliance and in the CMMC ecosystem. I am an RPA and a CCP. In global trade, I'm certified as an export compliance professional in the EAR, ITAR, and OFAC. I'm also a Six Sigma Green Belt. Thank you, Honeywell. Me and my husband of nearly 17 years have two very spoiled fur babies, a 15-year-old Jack Russell Terrier and a six-year-old Cavalier King Charles Spaniel. Another professional role I hold is that of Secretary for the International Sanctions and Export Control Society, which is a public benefit company, and the only one of its kind in the world dedicated to helping industries worldwide enhance compliance with international sanctions and export control. The society's their network, it's a collaboration between industry leaders, current and former government regulatory and enforcement officials, attorneys, and experienced compliance professionals like myself. So that's an exciting and rewarding endeavor too. And if that wasn't enough, I also attend law school, and I'm working towards obtaining a master's in legal studies with a focus on contract management. This will be my second master's degree and probably my last. And in September, I get to add the role of great aunt to my list, and so I'm excited about that.
Oh, the highest of all honors.
Yes.
That's awesome.
Of course. Yeah.
Man,
I'm excited for
you
her.
have more acronyms than I think the DoD has acronyms, Wendy, with as much as you've accomplished.
I had a colleague tell me, make it a goal to get every letter of the alphabet after your name as a post-nominal.
Hey, I would say you're well on the path to be able to accomplish that, Wendy.
Yeah.
Well, you and I got to meet on that panel for the first time in Denver, Colorado, a couple of years ago. And we were wrestling with regulated research and how it kind of feels like the DoD's overlooked a lot of key elements for higher ed when they were building the CMMC program, right? And, you know, most of the people that I talk to are traditional defense contractors. They're manufacturers, right? They're making a part, a gizmo, a missile, a tank, a UAV, whatever it might be. And when I really got to talk to you and the whole team on the panel, I realized that higher ed has some very unique problems that what I would call the regular defense industry does not even touch, right? I mean, from grad students doing their own thing to non-US persons being prevalent in that space to a combination of export control and CUI. And don't forget fundamental research, right? And all of these different components kind of making up what you do and have to oversee to not only produce a product, right, which, you know, research would end up in some sort of product to some degree, but also make sure that all of the check boxes are checked. That's really, really hard to do. So do you mind kind of laying it out there a little bit and kind of walking me through any other landmines that are unique to higher ed that, you know, any other, you know, research institute might be kind of like, yeah, Wendy, say that, you know, like kind of in agreement that, yeah, these are problems we all face?
I've got some people that'll tell me, oh, Wendy's on her soapbox again. But, you know, Daniel, first of all, thanks for asking that question, because I feel many people, especially defense contractors, they really just don't fully understand the dynamics of research in higher education. These dynamics, they're primarily rooted in higher ed's distinct missions, their organizational structures, their funding models, their regulatory compliance environments. And while defense contractors and higher ed researchers must protect CUI, there are several unique problems. And all right, so let's attack the biggest part of it right up front. Let's talk about the IT environment.
Yep.
Traditionally, defense contractors have a centralized hierarchical IT environment that facilitate a uniform implementation of cybersecurity controls across the enterprise. That's not the case for universities. They often have highly decentralized IT systems with individual colleges, departments, and even research labs maintaining separate infrastructure, governance, and policies. And this fragmentation makes it challenging to consistently implement CMMC or any other kind of standardized framework, especially across boundaries between administrative units and research domains. The unique problem with implementing and maturing a uniform CMMC compliance program, especially at levels 2 or 3, is it requires significant coordination across siloed units, which cannot just be managed technically, right? There's a political challenge because of those dynamics I mentioned. This is what makes completing those questionnaires of what a university's compliance with 800-171 from our industry partners is a challenge, because they're phrased in asking for what's our compliance across the entire university. Yep. And we can't provide that kind of information. And the questionnaires aren't flexible to be able to scope the questionnaire to a specific project or a specific system. And I also want to point out that these questionnaires are now also starting to ask for an IT point of contact. Because of that decentralized structure, it's not going to be the same IT person. There's going to be different IT managers that are responsible for those different systems, depending on where it's at, right? Another unique problem is that of the open research culture of higher ed. Traditional defense contractors are accustomed to working in a closed, classified, or proprietary environment where everything is restricted, you've got a badge for everything, right? They may even have whole buildings for that purpose. In higher ed, there's an emphasis of open science, collaboration, and the free exchange of ideas, right? These values often conflict with the CMMC requirement to limit dissemination of CUI and enforce strict access controls. Also, you can have a lab that is closed off to one researcher. It has a badge reader access on it and all that. But right across the hall, as soon as you open that door, there's an open lab that has no controls. So balancing compliance with institutional commitments to academic freedom, open access, the publishing, international collaboration, all this presents a recurring legal and operational dilemma in higher ed. And that kind of brings me to my other point, or my next point. We've got foreign collaborations and students, and traditional defense contractors. They often will limit foreign nationals' access to sensitive projects by default. Especially those that are subject to export controls. I know when I worked for a defense contractor, we had specific area of the cube farm that the foreign persons had to sit in, and they couldn't go to a printer because we couldn't trust what else was being printed off of that. It was, very frustrating for them. So I get this from the PI standpoint, but higher ed welcomes a large international population with grad students, visiting scholars, faculty from all around the world, and they're actively participating in all sorts of fundamental and novel research. The requirement to limit access to CUI can conflict with non-discrimination policies, federal regulations. So we want to be very careful about excluding foreign persons, and that raises a legal and ethical issue. And so then you got to go, okay, now how do we handle CUI identification and management, right? Well, traditional defense contractors, they typically have organizational processes for marking and handling and storing CUI. They've got that prior experience from other highly sensitive projects. But higher ed, they continue to struggle with identifying what constitutes CUI, especially since research projects may mix CUI and non-CUI. Researchers generally are not trained in data classification. And as we heard, the marking of CUI from the authorized holder has been inconsistent or even non-existent. And that further complicates things, and it creates confusion for the researchers. And that failure to properly identify CUI by the authorized holder leads to both over and underscoping of compliance boundaries. And so that increases legal risk or unnecessary overhead. Now, some people may go, well, why don't you just look at the contract? It's all there in the contract. And that's probably what I would say too, right? But traditional defense contractors, they typically understand and they're adept to negotiate DoD contract clauses, and they're very familiar with the FAR and the DFARS requirements, or at least we hope so. However, while higher ed does have some federal contracts, more often they are subcontracting with a prime contractor or other subcontractor, or they receive federal grants, right? CMMC applicability to grants is often ambiguous. Prime contractors inappropriately sometimes flow down requirements, and they're not clear. We might get bits and pieces cut out, and you're like, what is this? The inconsistent interpretation of CUI or CMMC obligations is a very real and constant struggle. And because there's so much confusion still, we are seeing a blanket approach where primes and even some contracting officers in the government say to treat it as if it is CUI or as if it is ITAR. And this is a horrible approach. And I've seen it throughout my nearly 20 years of experience as a compliance professional. The problem with this is when you treat something as if it is ITAR or some other thing that needs type protection, if there is a potential violation and you start investigating and then you discover, oh, it wasn't ITAR, well, that doesn't matter. You're under the contractual obligation and thus the legal requirement to protect it under the ITAR. And that's what was agreed to. So my recommendation is if someone ever says treat it as if it were export controlled or CUI, don't accept that. Insist that things are marked with the specific classifications so you know exactly what protective measures, if any, need to be put in place, right? Don't give in to the pressures of having to get that contract signed. Take the time, get it done right. It's insisting on those classifications and the clarity of how the materials or the data need to protect it. It's a good thing for all parties to the contract, right? It's a win-win for everybody.
One of my favorite sayings is like clarity is kindness, right? It's like if we can provide a level of clarity, we can probably descope and decontrol a lot of things that are actually not CUI or don't need to be CUI going downstream. And I think that tension is where so many people have sat for such a long time is like, just mark it. They're throwing back to the old FOUO days, right? They're just like, listen, it's sensitive. Just slap a CUI sticker on there. who cares if there's no law, regulation, or government-wide policy? It's sensitive to us, right? It's like, that's not how it works.
No, you're doing yourself a disservice, really, by putting that blanket cover over it. You're making things more difficult than they have to be, and why should you, right? I mean, if you can do it easier, if you don't need to have that specific restrictive control on it, why? So just do it right. Just take the time and do it right. And I think the last thing that is unique for higher ed compared to typical defense contractors is budget constraints and mission misalignments that we see. Traditional defense contractors often operate on a for-profit model and are accustomed to incorporating compliance costs into their business models and contract pricing. Higher ed, on the other hand, we operate on constrained budgets with limited ability to pass through costs. So research projects that fall under CMMC or export controls or some other regulatory compliance program, they may have very slim to no cost recovery allowances for cybersecurity measures or upgrades. And this means universities must fund compliance using central or indirect costs, making sustained investments for controlled research projects challenging. And more often than not, it creates tension with faculty, staff, and research administration. So you can see that while there's a similar baseline, right? Higher ed does face unique cultural, structural, legal, financial challenges that complicate implementation and maintenance and maturity for CMMC.
So that actually leads me to a question that I kind of stumbled upon accidentally. So I have a dear friend who does research down at Auburn University in the like biology sphere, right? And I didn't realize this, but a researcher, if there's not appropriate funding, will likely just kind of uplift them and the grad students working with them and move to another university where they have funding. I didn't realize that the research dollars are typically tied to the person doing the research, not the university specifically. And so now you have kind of a people problem, right? Where universities and higher ed want to keep that person, right? Because they're bringing money, real money into the university for the research they're doing, and they don't want them to go somewhere else, right? Whereas in traditional DoD world, you control the BD team, right? I can control what they can sell and not sell. Whereas if it's an individual getting the grant or the funding from the DoD to do the work, like it kind of follows them. And I didn't realize it was kind of that the ability to detach that easily, you could say, and just move it from Auburn to this other university and just keep on with their same level of research and grab their grad students along the way. So there's so many little pieces that are like, not that the university doesn't have control of, but they're incentivized to let the researcher pursue as much work as possible to keep them happy. And that's where that balance of like collaboration and compliance comes into play, where a lot of people don't want to put too many constraints over them, right? Because they want the funding to come in. But in our world, when we talk about it, there has to be a level of accountability. Like I've heard, man, Wendy, it's horror story time. Okay. Now I get to talk to a lot of higher ed. And here's a couple of things. I remember talking to somebody on the GRC side of the house at a very large university doing research. And they were like, yeah, we just found 2 high performance compute clusters that we did not know existed. They didn't even know they were there doing regulated research. And the regulated research oversight didn't know those systems even existed. Or another one is just like, hey, to your point, everything's so decentralized. We don't know what the School of Engineering is doing. Okay, well, who's signing for the SPRS score? Do you guys even know who's obligating the university to a score that may or may not be correct? I mean, we've seen this with Penn State and Georgia Tech, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot more coming out before too long. But like there are so many little things that are very problematic.
Yeah, uh, it is very nuanced in higher education. It certainly requires um, a multi-pronged strategy, right? That harmonizes regulatory obligations with that mission of open inquiry and global engagement, and certainly using secure research enclaves, that's one element. But like you said, right, here's two HPCs that popped up out of the middle of nowhere. Nobody knew they even existed. How many CPUs are sitting under a researcher's desk, that nobody really knows about. But with this compliance, balancing compliance and collaboration, there are some institutions that have gotten very good at negotiating CUI exclusions and getting the clarifications, while others have just taken the position that their university, we're only going to allow fundamental research. And that means they're not going to accept anything that voids that fundamental research exclusion. So some institutions, they've amped up their training for principal investigators. Those are the lead researchers on a project, right? So just like you were saying, a researcher can go to another institution and take that project with them, right? So that's the PI. There are other institutions, they're creating things like a research security office or some other named central office for compliance and oversight. They're identifying a central authority for research-related CUI. Most institutions are doing very well at leveraging technology solutions such as data loss prevention tools and role-based access controls for research, that document management and labeling, as well as logging and monitoring, but we're still decentralized, right? We only know what we know. So the key, I think, to balancing compliance with collaboration, especially in higher ed, lies in precision and segmentation, right? We create well-defined spaces and governance structures where compliance-intensive work can occur without compromising the university's broader commitment to open global research. Secured enclaves, that's great, but we need formalized governance, and that has to come from the provost or the university president. It really needs that top level support, right? Contractors need training to learn how to, and when I say contractors, I'm talking about our contract negotiators. They need training to learn how to negotiate those clear contract terms that involve controlled research. And researchers need to be empowered and supported with tools and the training to work on controlled research, right? This is not where one office should be doing everything. It is a shared responsibility across the institution. And if everybody does their part, institutions can protect the national security interests while still advancing the frontiers of science. But we all have to work together, and we have to stop doing this.
We have to stop. I see that all the time, because higher ed or universities will come and they'll be like, Daniel, how are other people solving this? And the two things that get brought up, and you nailed it. The first one was decentralized, who owns it, and the lack of a governance plan. It's like, we don't have anyone that actually wants this hot potato. Is it the CIO's office? Is it CISO's? Is it school dependent, right? Is it the School of Engineering has their enclave and so forth and so on? Like the governance plan and the ownership piece, it's just so hard to figure out where should that responsibility sit? What has been your experience? I've been seeing a move to the CIO for a lot of these universities starting to take direct oversight and been empowered to do so. Are you still seeing a lot of decentralized, or are you seeing kind of a consolidation effort because they saw the Penn State and the Georgia Tech risk and they don't want to open themselves up to that?
I think it's a mixed bag. at this point, but I think we're still dealing with a lot of decentralized issues. What I have been witnessing is more of, okay, we're establishing a central office to manage this kind of stuff, but the individuals in that office lack the knowledge to really grasp and comprehend the depth and breadth of what is needed here. Here at the University of Arizona, we are partners with our central office. We work with them. We are not the signing authority, so that our CISO is not that person. We let this central office be that central authority for research related CUI, but we work with them and we help them. My new program, Information Security Maturity, will be helping the researchers, like those who have the CPU under their desk that they're using for researchers, and we're going to be working with them and holding their hand and helping them to understand what they need and identifying what they have and helping them get across the finish line. And so I think there are some institutions that are still very new in trying to figure this all out. And then there's others like the University of Arizona that are advanced and we're starting to take the next step, right? We're out of maybe that infancy stage where we're not necessarily crawling anymore, but not quite walking. You know, we're still a little wobbly maybe. I don't know. But in either case, we're advancing the best way we know at this point in time, and who knows where we'll be next year. And I think that's all we can continue about, and that's what the second M in CMMC is about, right? Is maturity. And so this is a part of that maturity process. Is we're saying, okay, now we've got our enclave up and running. We have a central office. Now, how do we start attacking some of the decentralized aspects of controlled research? And so we're doing what we know we can do to help our researchers.
Well, I can tell you from the higher ed that I talk to, you guys are well advanced. A lot of people are still struggling to find people to even begin to build a program. And I'll say this, it's very refreshing that people are taking this more seriously, because a lot of universities have done regulated research in some capacity for decades, right? Based on what they've done. It's nice to see this air of, we've really got to actively solve this problem because we want to keep this coming into the university, be valuable, do incredibly valuable research. And you mentioned something a little while ago, and for the listeners out there that might not know, a lot of higher ed, and you mentioned this, some universities are just focusing solely on fundamental research and not even working towards CUI, right? Because fundamental research is a little bit safer, a lot less overlay from a requirement standpoint. Can you explain for the listeners, okay, what's fundamental research? When could it become CUI? Could it ever become CUI? How do you guys navigate that kind of internally, and what have you seen in the industry?
I want to say, you got to tread very carefully, right?
Oh, yes.
But, it really is, it's a critical task, right? Because you can cross the line so fast and not even know it. But whether you're a defense contractor or a researcher, right, you got to know what controls or safeguards are needed with whatever it is that you're working with. Even with fundamental research, you don't want that effort to get into the wrong hands and get out and published by somebody else who's stolen all that hard work. So even fundamental research needs to be protected at its basic level, if you will. So the first place I always recommend people look at the definitions, look at the legal foundations, right? So you've got the National Security Decision Directive 189. This was adopted in the export controls regulations It tells you the criteria for fundamental research, and that criteria has 3 things. There's no publication restrictions. There are no restrictions on foreign person participation in the research, and the results of the research are intended for public dissemination, even if that funding is from a government agency, right? So if it's those 3 things, then you should be in that bucket for its fundamental research. Now, CUI, that's defined in 32 CFR Part 2002. And I'm surprised at the number of people that do not look at that law. But
it shocks me. I just recorded a different podcast where this was brought up, and it brought up so much. I'm going to share my screen because I feel like people should see this, because you're right. People don't look at this. Just because something is marked CUI does not mean it's CUI. Like, there has to be law, regulation, government-wide policy. Sorry to steal your thunder there, Wendy, but I'll let you continue on here.
No, and you see it, right? It simply says that a law, a regulation, a government-wide policy requires that the information has to have safeguarding or dissemination controls, but that information is not considered classified, right? Now, classified information, that's a whole other animal. If you think you're doing this and you've got classified information, you're confused. So, if we just look at NARA's registry, there's 126 categories of information that are considered CUI, and that list has grown since this all came about. So don't just get stuck on one thing. You're going to have to check it periodically too to make sure that something else hasn't popped up. Anyway, but now we're back to our contract terms, right?
Yep.
And we start putting the pieces of the puzzle together. This is where you're looking for those publication rights, foreign person participation, data markings, FAR, and other supplemental government clauses, any cybersecurity requirements. You also want to look to see where the sources of data are, right?
Yep.
Is it being generated by the institution, or are you getting it from the government, the sponsor, or some other third party? But it's not all cut and dry, because you've got to segment those scopes for your project. Like I said, you could have a hybrid, right, where there's FRE and there's restrictive elements. So you got to break those out, and then you got to look to see what's where, what's in what bucket. You also should look at the proposals, look at the broad agency announcements carefully for details. Those all can give you clues. If they're not outright in your face, this is going to be CUI, they will give you indications that there's going to be restrictions that could make it very hard for you to do the work. So you then have to make that decision. Can you do the work under those restrictions? And we've actually had researchers say, you know what, I can't work under that. And they've turned the award down. And yeah, a lot of them, they look at the big money. Some of them are not big money, but some, others are going, well, this would really help me a lot with the research field that I'm in, and I really want to do this. And so they're willing to work under those constraints. Others have gotten very good at working under those constraints and used to it, but others who are new to it, they're like, I don't know about this. So they'll back out. But anyway, in the research context, CUI, it can exist in a lot of different places, and we see it probably mostly with those connections to export controls, the defense work, nuclear, space, certainly specialized computer sciences. There's just not really, like, you've got this bucket, right? And research CUI is going to be in this bucket. That's not really how it works. And so you just never know where it's going to pop in. But as cyber threats continue, we should not be surprised to see those contractual obligations require 800-171 compliance, or some other level of cybersecurity controls. It's growing, and we're seeing more and more government agencies adopt the CMMC-like program for their individual programs.
So you mentioned something earlier that I actually kind of latched onto, because I'm in sales at Summit 7. That's my primary role here. And, I go after work, I bring work in, I hand it off to our delivery team. And most regular defense contractors, they have a BD, they get a solicitation, they draft a proposal, they respond, and onward and upward, right? The interesting thing that you brought up is a researcher hears about some sort of grant opportunity, let's say. Would you recommend, and is this typically how it works, the researchers would then take that solicitation and come to you, Wendy, or somebody on the team and say, hey, like, I really want to do this thing. Can we even do it? Do we have an environment set up for me to be able to do this kind of research? And do you get to have that kind of input in that decision-making process? Or is it input that you would recommend, right? That universities start setting up that feedback loop of basically the sales process back to almost IT and compliance, and then back around to say, hey, can we even support this even if you wanted to do it?
I think every compliance professional out there would celebrate a researcher, an administrator, somebody that is coming to them at the front end of things instead of the back end of things.
By the way, that's the same in the corporate DoD world as well. People will win stuff without any understanding. Can we actually execute this work?
Yeah, it's true anywhere, right? But look, once the toothpaste is out of the tube, it's a little hard to put back in. So yeah, if we could change the culture so that researchers or whoever is coming to the compliance professional, the compliance offices, and saying, hey, I don't understand. What does this mean when it's saying CUI or 800-171? Can we comply with that? Do we have the resources? What's this going to cost me? How do I build that into my proposal? Those kinds of things. Man, it would be a much different story, I think, for not just higher ed, but also to the sponsors, the primes that are also engaging directly with the DoD or other government agencies. And I think you're evolving, and you're creating a more robust compliance program at that point. And also too, when that starts happening, your compliance professionals are going, we're doing something right. Because I know it was gratifying for me when I was leading the export compliance programs at the University of Miami, and I was getting my researchers coming to me going, hey, I saw this agency announcement, and is this an issue for me? When you've got people doing that and reaching out to you in advance and asking those questions up front, and this isn't them putting in a quick submission at the 11th hour because they sat for the last 4 weeks deciding whether or not they wanted to submit that proposal, whatever the case may be.
Sure.
But I think that's the other problem too, is some of the researchers are submitting their proposals at the 11th hour, and they don't necessarily have somebody they can reach out to at 11 o'clock at night to ask, what is CMMC or CUI?
What is ITAR? Can I do this? Can I not do this? It's all and that's
so kind of time management practices need to be worked on.
Well, I know you mentioned something, and you have an immense amount of experience in the export control space, not just controlled and classified information, but one of the things that I've seen a lot is, like, Daniel, like, we get basic CUI. We can apply the 110 controls. We know about FedRAMP clouds, but we don't know how to crack the non-US persons piece because they're everywhere on our campus, right? And we want that. We want to have people wanting to come from all over the world to come study and do their research here. But obviously there's kind of this overlay of, like, can they? How much can they do? Do I need a TAA? Do I need, fill in the blank, right? What's some good approaches for higher ed to approach export control regulations in a research world?
You've got to have a strong individual in that role, right? That can reach and work with those researchers, not just to spew out what I call regulation regurgitation.
Sure.
Okay. Telling them what the regulation says doesn't mean anything to them. You've got to reach their heart, right?
Yeah.
You've got to help them be able to apply what it is that you need. And so I think careful structuring, you've got to have those risk-based controls. You've got to have a strong commitment from institutional leadership that supports this level of compliance requirements. Managing export controls in higher education is definitely not about excluding foreign persons.
Yep.
It's about isolating and protecting the small percentage. It really is a small percentage of research that truly requires control. And so through proper segmentation, using technology control plans, the secure enclaves, preserving the fundamental research exclusion in contracts, training, you can achieve both compliance and inclusivity. It's a lot of work. It requires building a network of campus partners who all have a share in making compliance with export control successful. There are going to be situations where a license needs to be applied for so that a foreign person can work on a research project. But there are also situations where a license can't be obtained, and that's because maybe the government has a policy of denial. For me, what I have always found is that I don't want to be an obstacle to a research project. I want to be a partner. And the researchers are more understanding and they are more willing to work with you. And under those less than ideal work structures for the benefit of the project, when you approach them in that way of, here's my hand, please take it. I will help you through this process. And so I think that's key. Is for a successful export control program, at least the ones that I have led, it has been having that two-way communication, not being quick to say no, not spewing out, this is what the regulations say. It's, okay, tell me what you want to do.
Yep.
Who's involved? Where are we going? What countries are involved? Et cetera, et cetera. Just be honest with me. And I let them do all the talking before I make any advice, because first of all, researchers love to talk, and that's how I get information. But knowing the details will give you a lot of insight into knowing, do we need a TAA? Do we need a deemed export license? Is the thing tightly controlled? Which jurisdiction of the export control regulations does it fall under? Is there a foreign government involved? Again, it's another puzzle that you have to put all the pieces together. And if the export controls falls into the CUI realm, then it's just, okay, we did this part of the puzzle over here, now we're going to do this part of the puzzle, and we're going to find a way to meet them in the middle. And so it's really just bringing those pieces of the puzzle together. But I think to me, that's how I've always looked at things, is that it's just one big puzzle, and we've got to find all those pieces in order to make the picture come together.
Talking about puzzles, Wendy, one of the things that is always fun, and we talked about this even before we started the record button here, data flow and asset classification, right? So in CMMC, you've got CUI assets, security protection assets, CRMAs, and specialized assets. Well, you have to know the data flow and you have to know the assets that you're classifying as in order to apply the correct protections upon said assets. But higher ed has assets that I could not even pronounce the name of, even if I tried out there. You guys are doing cutting, bleeding edge stuff, quantum, HPC type work with large amounts of data sets, right? Huge data sets. How specialized assets, I'll just be honest, it was built for manufacturers. That was the scapegoat that the DoD kind of wrote for manufacturers. I don't think they meant it to be used by higher ed and regulated research because they didn't think about it in that application sense. What has been your experience with this asset type, and how are you classifying these things in labs? Like, how do you solve this problem?
So I have to speak to this in a general way, right? Because this hasn't actually come across my desk, but this is very much a unique animal, and I don't think it's one that is well understood even by our defense contractors, right? Yep. But it is critical, and you're right. Higher ed has got a lot of neat toys. We've got at the University of Arizona, we've got 2 wind tunnels, and that's so cool. You know, that's something that is key to a lot of research. It's also something you can't put into an enclave.
No, you cannot.
No,
it's hard to shove a wind tunnel into an enclave the last time I checked. So
we also have a I forget, what do they call it? I forget exactly what they call it, but it's basically this chamber that simulates zero gravity. So we're testing spacesuits in there and stuff.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so we're doing some neat things at the University of Arizona, but again, it's not something you can put into an enclave, right? No. But these are key pieces of equipment that could be, I can't say for sure if they are doing CUI, but they certainly have that potential to be used in projects that contain CUI. And so you're like, okay, how do we do this? Because they can't be fully secured, but they are processing, storing, or transmitting CUI. So now you have to go, you've got to examine those functional constraints. You've got to look at the operational criticality, look at the CUI exposure. How can you segment the asset, right? We've talked a lot about segmentation, right? Are there compensating controls that you can use? What are the limitations, and so forth? And so you really kind of got to break this down. And then you have to document everything. You have to use a risk-based approach. Then you have to justify your decision on how you've managed all of this. And so it's no different from a defense contractor having to do the same thing. But I think what probably makes this issue different in higher ed is that the research equipment generally falls out. I won't say generally, it is outside the scope of the responsibility of the IT department. And the equipment is usually managed by a principal investigator or an administrator or some other technician. And this is where those assets need to be reviewed by that central office I was talking about earlier that oversees research related CUI. And if that institution has one, I think that's the office that should be overseeing it, right? It should get documented in the SSP, of course, but I think also too, it should be referenced somewhere in the technology control plan. And, you show that connection of where everything is pointing to make sure that your documentation is lined up and you've done your due diligence. And so I think this is something that is a big hurdle for a lot of institutions on how you manage, because like you said, sometimes you don't even know about, there's 2 HPCs over in the College of Engineering, there's something under somebody's desk, and you're like, what? I didn't even know about this. So again, we're back to that decentralized nature of things. And a big part of any compliance professional's job is education. And I think, not to create a pun of any sort, but really, I think higher ed has got to be better about training and educating its researchers on some of these nuances. And even the compliance professionals that are responsible for helping people need to understand this a little better.
Well, with that, I know that we've talked about historically a lot of resources and tools that you've been able to kind of put together. And there's a team of people doing CUI and CMMC support in academia, in higher ed. In your kind of world, because of the nuances of regulated research, are there any resources that you would recommend outside of maybe the DoD CIO's website for CMMC resources? Any higher ed or research specific that you found helpful?
Sorry, had a coughing fit there.
No, that's okay. It happens to us all.
Sorry. I think the big one for higher ed is going to be EDUCAUSE.
EDUCAUSE, okay.
EDUCAUSE. And it's specific for higher ed. And industry can look at membership opportunities with EDUCAUSE as well. Most institutions are members, so individuals who are affiliated with a member institution don't have to pay for membership fee.
Oh, nice.
But excuse me. But EDUCAUSE advocates for institutions of higher education in a variety of ways, even with bringing in subject matter experts together to respond to proposed rules during the public comment period. They have oodles of reports and research analysis. They have the Higher Education Community Vendor Assessment Toolkit, the HECVAT for short. And this is a tool for evaluating third parties. It's kind of like a self-assessment for third parties. They also have community groups. So I lead a community group called the Regulated Information Security Compliance, or RISC for short. So yeah, educause.edu, that would be one place I would go. Another resource I highly recommend is the Regulated Research Community of Practice, or RCOP. And this is a community of research institutions that support research subject to compliance regulations and work together to help find solutions and produce efficiencies. So that's regulatedresearch.org. And then for training, I would say the Collaborative Institutional Training Initiative program. We usually just say CITI program or CITI program. They are a great resource for different training topics, including export controls and research security. So that's citiprogram.org.
And that is CITI program?
Yep, CITIprogram.org.
There it is. Fantastic. Well, with all of this incredible information that you've given us today, I always like to ask people at the very end, any closing remarks, recommendations, do this, don't do this, watch out for that landmine over there. Wendy, anything like that that you'd like to leave the people with today?
Oh, I please read your contracts. That's my big thing lately, is read your contracts, take your time. I know they're lengthy. I know nobody wants to sit on a Friday afternoon to read 55 pages of a contract, but looking for those pieces to your puzzle will help you in the long run, because everything is not necessarily clear and identified with embolded titles. So
not
go ahead,
highlighted, not a bunch of exclamation marks, just like a 33 pages of DFARS and FAR clauses.
Yeah. The more you do it, the more you get used to it. I've been doing it for quite a while, but I still read every single page because I just never know where I'm going to find that oddly shaped puzzle piece that's going to help fit. Oh, that's exactly what I needed. So please do read your contracts and and do your due diligence on your vendors.
That's great advice, especially the vendor piece, because a lot of people do not do due diligence in their supply chain or their vendors, which causes problems down the line. So,
Yeah.
Wendy, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to add your LinkedIn to the show notes. That way people can connect with you there and read all the incredible articles that you post on that side. And with that, we will close out the show, and everybody have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.